So I was born in Plymouth, but I grew up in Falmouth, so I was just born in Plymouth. So I can't technically say born and raised on Cape Cod, but since I was a few days old, we went to my house in in Falmouth. I'm the fourth generation to live in Falmouth on my father's side, so I've been on the Cape for a while. So my great-grandfather immigrated here from Cape Verde when he was 17. And I believe his brother was already here in the States, but they left behind their parents and came here. I'm not sure why they chose to settle on the Cape. I don't know if it was just an opportunity, but that was where they happened to settle. And my great-grandfather made a name for himself in the town and then bought a house. And so my grandfather's lived on the same street his whole life. Yeah, he was one of the only people who could speak English really well in the Cape Verdean community that there was in Falmouth, and so he was sort of an advocate for a lot of people and like a translator. So I know he did a lot of that, I mean, for free. But in terms of his actual job, I actually don't really know what he did. Yeah, I think my whole dad's side of the family, they all are in sort of public roles. Like my grandfather was a chief of detectives in Falmouth. He was the first Cape Verdean to be a sergeant, so that was really exciting. He did a lot for the community as well, and then also my dad's cousin Jay, Corey, he was a huge force in Falmouth as well, especially in the basketball community, and he passed away when I was really little, but the legacy that he left behind was just everlasting within our family. So I think I had a lot of positive role models in the community that definitely inspired me growing up to give back to my community. I've always been pretty outspoken when it comes to things surrounding justice, specifically social justice. I was really outspoken in high school. I call this sort of my origin story, which is when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I talked a lot about it in high school, and I feel like a lot of my classmates weren't really on the same page. Like they didn't really know what was going on. They weren't really following the story, but I think it really hit home for me. Being black in America and, you know, having cousins that look like Trayvon Martin, were male, and knowing that it could happen to anybody in my family. And similar things have also happened to my dad. So definitely hit home for me, and I didn't stop talking about it, even though I didn't feel like people in this community were particularly interested in listening. And then in college, you know, things just got progressively worse. And the Black Lives Matter movement really started to ramp up when I was in college, and I started taking classes and learning more about, you know, institutionalized racism in this country and how it's way worse than I think anyone really realizes when they're growing up here. And so that just kind of lit a fire in me, and yeah, like I said, I just didn't stop talking about it. And my friend from high school, Chandler Alves, she had noticed that in 2020, when again there was sort of this ramp up again of the Black Lives Matter movement, she had noticed that I was really outspoken about it on social media, and her sister Miranda were really passionate about it as well, because they also had family experiences with racism, specifically with the cops in Barnstable. And so they were going to protests, and, you know, I think the narrative at that time was like, listen to black people, listen to people of color, amplify their voices, but we would be going there and it would all be white people saying that, and there was no black or brown voices speaking up. So it was sort of like, there's sort of a disconnect, I feel like, on the Cape, which it is predominantly a white area, so it's just somewhat be expected, but it's still a little disappointing. And so she was like, we want to have our own event. Would you like to be included? Would you like to help or speak at it or do anything? And I was like, absolutely, count me in. And then we also pulled in our other friend from high school, Augusta Davis. And so the four of us did a POC speak up. It was on the Hyannis Village Green. And we had about 10 speakers. I was one of them. I think Chandler was as well. And we just talked about our experiences, either growing up here or people who didn't grow up here but moved here as an adult, and their experiences with racism in our own community. Because I think a lot of the narrative as well was that it doesn't happen on the Cape, it happens when you go into these inner cities like Boston and things like that. And it was just like, that's not true. Like, we have proof, like we've experienced it, our families have experienced it for generations, and so it was a really powerful day, and we loved the feeling of bringing our communities together, especially our community of color, because there is so few of us here, or at least it feels like it sometimes. So we just kept going with it, and Miranda and Chandler kind of coined us Cape Cod Voices, and so they are really the founders of our nonprofit. So we applied for nonprofitship in 2021, and he got it, and so we've been doing community work ever since. So I think at first we were showing up to a lot of the protests that were happening in 2020. So I would like MC one, or we would just speak out at them. And then we were sort of noticing a pattern that a lot of people had a lot of their first incidences of racism in schools, in the school system. And we really saw that the children were still feeling the same sort of pain that we felt when we were younger, but we didn't know how to voice that. And so we were so proud of the younger generation for being able to speak out against the racism that they're experiencing and all the feelings that they had surrounding it. And so we were really inspired by the youth, and we really wanted to do something in the school system. So we started doing professional developments for teachers in the local school systems. So we were doing a lot of that, and then in 2020 and 2021, and then after we got our nonprofitship, we just continued to roll with that. And so that's then a lot of our focus is working with teachers and sometimes the students as well. We also have our support group or affinity group for students of color and their families called RISE. So that's a lot of what we've been doing. And then in 2022, we got a grant with 3 other nonprofits. So the Cordial Eye, Belonging Books, and Amplify POC. We got an Arts and Justice Collective grant. And so we basically got money to put on more community events. So that's sort of what we've been doing this past year with those 3 groups. But a lot of the feedback we have has been very positive, and just people saying like, thank you for being here, thank you for doing these events, thank you for bringing us together. And definitely have noticed a change in the teachers, and even just because throughout the years, you know, we've sometimes gone to the same schools and sometimes it's been different schools, but to even see how teachers are thinking more critically about anti-racism has been really great to see. And again, the students just speaking up and like fighting back and you know, really standing up for what they believe in has been really awesome to see. But yeah, I think the feedback is just for us to just be visible, keep going, that people are glad that we're here. And so it's like, how do you gently kind of dissuade people from being like, well, it's not really for you, you know, it's not really designed to be for you. So that's, I know, some of the pushback that we've sort of all experienced is sort of that confusion of like, so why is this really needed? Like, what is really the purpose here? So I'm, you know, not everybody is on board, and not everybody I feel like is in the same place. But that's okay. There was a really great analogy that someone had told us as we've had many meetings and Cape Cod Voices with people over the years, and so it's hard to remember, but someone, I believe she was a professor in the university in Boston, and she was sort of saying that the anti-racism train is sort of like a train where some people are on it on the first stop, and some people don't get on until like later down the track, and some people never get on it. And so we sort of sort of roll with that, and so sometimes we have to remind ourselves like, you know what, not everyone's getting on at the same stop. So we tell ourselves that to make ourselves feel better. Yeah, and there's definitely some groups you know, that we associate with that are willing to meet people where they're at and sort of do that way. I feel like we have somewhat of a, as Cape Cod Voices, have somewhat of a more, I don't want to say harsh approach, but we have our boundaries that, you know, we're not willing to work with people that we don't think are fighting the same fight that we are. And so, you know, for example, we don't do events where people are going to invite cops to speak or things like that. It's just like a hard boundary that we're like, we don't agree with that. We don't see the value in that within our communities. That doesn't make us feel safe. So we don't want to participate in those sorts of things, or we don't want to participate in something where it's supposed to be about people of color and giving people of color a voice, but then you have white speakers on your panel or non-Black people on your panel. That's not something that we're willing to put our names on back 100%. So I don't even think I mentioned our mission, which is to keep it Black and brown voices at the center of conversation around race. So it makes sense that if we're not being put first, we don't want to be involved. When I tell people I'm Cape Verdean, they are like automatically like, oh, are you from Brockton? Because Brockton has a huge Cape Verdean population. And I'm like, no. And they're like, New Bedford, which is sort of a secondary location. And I'm like, no. And then they're like, Boston? And then I'm like, well, why don't you just ask me instead of playing this guessing game? And I'm like, oh, I'm from Cape Cod. And then they're like, really? Like, it's always like, no one is ever not shocked that I'm from Cape Cod. But then when I say I'm from Cape Cod up front, without disclosing maybe that I'm Cape Verdean or something else, it's still sort of a like, like you grew up there, sort of like, and then it goes, you know, sort of assuming that I grew up on the beach in this beach house and I'm wealthy and have all these things. And so It's very interesting. I'm like, no, I'm just normal. Like, my house is in the woods. Like, I'm not really anywhere near the beach. Didn't really grow up on the water or anything. I don't have a boat. So it's definitely interesting. People have this very interesting idea of what Cape Cod is. Whether that's due to the Kennedys, I don't know. Or just like what it is in the media, but definitely people don't think that we're here. And I even, you know, will mention our indigenous populations that we have here, like the Wampanoags, and people kind of are like, what is that? Like, they don't even know, which is really scary to think about. And I don't know if it's maybe because I grew up on the Mashpee Falmouth line, and so I know a lot of Wampanoags, and, you know, I don't know, but I'm just like, how do people not know that that's like our indigenous tribe that we have here? Like, this is their land that we are on. These are their waters that we are on. Not like they're hidden or like a secret. So I don't know. It's really shocking to me how some people just have no idea what goes on the Cape. Or it's not even people that even live here. They just really don't know about these little pockets of communities of color. You know, the Cape Verdeans have been here for a few generations. Like I said, my great-grandfather was here. And then there's a thriving Brazilian population, a Jamaican population that we're seeing a huge influx of, especially in the lower Cape areas. You know, Provincetown Elementary School is 50% students of color right now, which is crazy. I never thought in my lifetime I would see that in a demographic on Cape Cod. But that's what I mean, people just don't know that we're here. And I think it's because we're just not portrayed, I guess, in the media very much. When talking about Cape Cod, we're not super visible. I think a lot of us work in more labor jobs or service industries, and so we're just sort of background characters to these people who come and are tourists here, and they don't really see us as humans in a way. So it's disappointing, definitely, having those conversations when people are surprised to know that I'm from Cape Cod, or that my family's been here for generations, and that Cape Verdeans are not the only ones who are here. So I can't say my family has really mentioned it too much. I know that my grandfather just always says, like, oh, you kids are lucky, because when he was growing up here, you know, segregation was so legal in the South, and he was drafted into the Marines during the Korean War, and he lived there for 2 years, and so he experienced that actual segregation of not being allowed in certain spaces because they were only for white people. And then when he came back up here, he really struggled to find a job, despite the fact that he had finished college and had a degree. Which ultimately is what led him to go to the police academy, because that's kind of the only place that would really accept him, which I think is a larger pattern of people joining the forces, or
That's okay.
sorts of jobs, because sometimes that's their only means of social mobility. And so he always just says, like, oh, you're lucky, because, you know, he feels like we have the world at our fingertips nowadays, because seemingly, like, there's less outward racism, you know, there's less discrimination, which I see his point, definitely. I think it's just, you know, there's still a lot of subtle racism that goes on, microaggressions, like little things that, you know, they're like paper cuts, you know, here and there, they don't hurt, but over time, if you get a million paper cuts, it's all going to hurt at once. I see his point, but yeah, in terms of housing, I mean, just in my own personal living, I no longer can afford to live on the Cape. I don't live on Cape Cod anymore, and I know that's like a real struggle for a lot of people in my family, but yeah. I mean, we're definitely underrepresented, like I said, not only just like in media and like history-wise, like people just don't talk about our history a lot, and so it's hard to see ourselves in that industry. And even growing up here, you know, a career in the maritime industry is never something that I thought about, because I didn't know anybody in the maritime industry. And I think it's also a class issue as well. So I know that one of your interview questions was, you know, talking about the water in your early life and things like that. And, you know, I grew up going to the beach a lot as a kid, being from Falmouth, going to Old Silver Beach with my mom a lot. My mom, who's white, but my dad, who's Cape Verdean, never took us to the beach. I don't have one memory. And I've asked him, he's like, I never took you guys to the beach. You know, and he grew up, his parents didn't take him to the beach. And so I can only assume my grandfather did not grow up going to the beach. So it's, I think, because our parents were always working, right? They're working. They're not thinking about having fun in the sun and going to the water and like having those experiences. So I feel very blessed that I was able to have a stay-at-home mom who was able to give me those experiences, but it's not something that a lot of people, even though growing up on a sort of a man-made island, have experiences on the water, grow up not knowing how to swim, not going to the beach, not having that in the forefront of their brain. So thinking about boats, you know, a lot of people, they've never been on one. They don't know, like, why would they ever dream about working on one if they don't even know how they work, or if they've never even experienced being on a boat or being on a ferry. Like, you know, they never went to Martha's Vineyard, they never went to Nantucket. So I just think that that's a huge thing that I think a lot of people don't understand, and that comes from a huge place of privilege. And I, you know, I've witnessed that myself, of people being shocked learning that people who grew up here don't have a relationship with the water. And that's, again, it comes from a huge place of privilege to be able to be shocked by that. We have our Center for Diversity and Inclusion. It's been renamed to the Paul Cuffey Center.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, so it's been really exciting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just because my family doesn't have really any ties to the maritime industry doesn't mean that no Cape Verdean family doesn't, or that no other communities of color don't, because they definitely do. But I just think it's something that I don't think people really think about, how communities of color really grow up here, or what their experiences are really like, in terms of relationship to the water necessarily.